we go. Rich, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. So when we started the curve, we expected that our work would be for chiefs and sheriffs and like maybe one level below. And as we've been doing these webinars and as we've been putting our work out, the thing that makes me super excited is the audience has really expanded. So I can guarantee you, you have chiefs and sheriffs, you have the one below them, but you also have rank and file. You have mid-ranking officers. You've got people who really, really, really care about changing the direction of policing and understand that the best change is going to happen from the inside out. And what we've recognized is that almost all the challenges that modern American policing are facing are leadership issues and culture issues, and they go together. You know, without good leadership, you don't have a good culture, and the only way to fix culture is with good leadership. Right. And if you look at the way that policing has evolved, you know, if you think about sort of modern leadership theory, you know, military is pretty far ahead. It's constantly teaching leadership. It's constantly tweaking and evolving it. You know, corporate world, obviously it's fits and starts. You know, some are great, some are terrible, but as a category, corporate world's pretty good, and policing is about 20 years behind. Right. In how they teach leaders, how they evaluate leaders, even how they nominate a leader. You know. And so I just wanted to have an open conversation with you about various subjects relating to leadership and culture to benefit these wonderful people who care so much on this line. Let me
just start by saying thank you for having me, and I start by saying a huge thank you to those who are in the audience. The law enforcement, first responder folks are absolutely 100% so necessary for us. And I will say, as a military person, we get to deploy and go out and do our jobs because we know our families are safe here because of you all. So it's a real pleasure, but also an honor to be here. So and I get to hang out with you, Simon, which is great to always catch up with an old friend. So
that's a great place to start, because and thank you for your kind words. I'm going to pick up on something you said. You said law enforcement and first responders. And one of the things that we have learned as we've been putting this out there is that we want police to stop using the term law enforcement. And the reason is really simple, is because enforcing the law is simply one thing that police do. They do a variety of things. And how terrible to define your whole profession based on one activity. Yes. Not to mention, if you send a rookie out and say you're in law enforcement, that rookie's going to go to look to enforce the law.
Yeah, it directs your mental state. Yeah,
directs your mental state. So what we say is, let's call this category police, of which one of the things they do is law enforcement. And the purpose of police, why do we have police? It's not just to enforce the law. Why do we have police? It's to protect the vulnerable from harm. So they have a sense of purpose. Yes. So let's pick that up. You know, what you learned about language, narrative, self-definition from your work in the SEAL teams.
Yes, so let me start with a distinction that I think you and I have talked about, but I want to definitely bring up with this group, and that is the distinction between hero and guardian. And the reason why I was thinking about this years ago is because I always getting this idea or getting this feedback that people were referring to us as heroes. And and it was always nice to hear. It was cool, but as I thought about the word hero, I said to myself, you know, it's interesting because hero, it comes with some interesting distinctions. First of all, hero, you can't self-designate as a hero. It's just someone has to define you as a hero. Heroism is conditional. It happens when it happens. It might happen at one point and not happen at another point. To be a hero is it's all good generally. Everything about it is good. Okay. And I said, you know, sure, thank you for that hero designation, but in fact, we are truly actually guardians. Guardian is different. Guardian, first of all, you can self-designate as a guardian. You can decide to be a guardian of someone, some group. Guardianship can be enduring. It's not just conditional. It can be enduring. It can be anytime, everywhere. And guardianship actually doesn't have to be all good. We, as guardians of our children, for example, we don't want to necessarily be our kids' heroes. We will be our guardians. We will do things for our children that may walk the line. And I used to say, you know, I think policing and the the profession of serving others in that capacity is one of the most, if not the most difficult professions out there. And it's because as SEALs, we can be guardians, but we're out there, we're not really seen. We're not in the public eye. We're kind of doing our thing. Take first responders, and we do a lot of work, and I know you do too, with firefighters and EMT. They can be the heroes most of the time. They're showing up when people are in need, and so they're kind of, it's always good. Police and policing involves both polarities, and you have to sometimes be the guardian, you have to sometimes be the hero, and that is a very difficult line to walk, especially when it's so viewed and in kind of the public eye. So I want to just acknowledge the fact that these definitions, these identities matter a great deal, and how difficult it is to run that balance.
Yeah. I'm curious to see in the SEAL teams, the guys who saw themselves as heroes versus the ones who saw themselves as guardians.
Yeah.
Were you like, how did they show up on the job, but also how did they show up, sort of just back on base when you're just sort of interacting with each other?
Here's my thought. And while there were some exceptions, I would say there are very few exceptions. I would say the high majority of guys saw themselves as guardians, not heroes. And the reason I believe is just the training pipeline. When you go to BUD/S, the person who thinks of themselves as a hero typically gets attrited quite quickly, or quits, because you recognize that it's not about you, it's about others. And your capacity to perform, your capacity to do the job is tied and linked to how much and how well you can serve others. It's so much of a team thing. And I think that the term hero sometimes also comes with this kind of self kind of designation, this kind of oneness about it. Yeah. And so I didn't see a lot of cases where guys thought of themselves as heroes. I think I saw much more of the other one. I think the guys who did, or people who do, I believe, wash out pretty quickly, or don't necessarily. They come in with a misperception of what Navy SEALs are, so they usually quit pretty quickly.
So let's move on. And by the way, add your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them. Where did you learn leadership? Like, you have written one book and you're writing more. No, you've written two books, right?
Yeah, the second one's coming out soon. Yeah.
So you've written two books about leadership. So you're at a level where you're telling others and offering ideas about leadership. And I know writing leadership books is hard because to offer something different is difficult. Yeah. Where did you learn it? Who did you learn it from? How did you learn it? Like, was it pre-SEALs? Was it in SEALs? Like, where did you get it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for me, leadership, first of all, I learned it, and I learned how to do it experientially just by being a leader in the teams. And so you learn it experientially. I learned how to articulate it more after I got out of the teams. When I started working with you, and we started working with our friends at the Chapman Institute, and I began to understand how to put language around this. But as I did that, I recognized that I began to learn leadership way before even the SEAL teams. And even with my dad, my parents, for example, my dad was someone who he would always look at a situation in a calm, logical manner. He would always ask our opinion before he made a decision. Even when we were emotional teens, he would often require us. I remember one day running down because I was so mad at my dad for something. I was 17 or something, and I wanted to yell at him for something. And as I came around the stairs and he's sitting in his chair, he looks at me and says, "Hey, stop. Just go back, take 5 minutes, and then come talk to me." Right. And what he was doing there was embodying a lesson of making sure I'm calm and collected before I go. I don't emotionally go in situations like that where I need to actually make a point or argue a perspective. And I think that type of leadership in him started to imprint on me. My mom was the same way. My mom was always about, hey, what do you want to do? How do you want to present yourself to the world? I remember my mom really young. It's amazing how things stick with you. But I was probably 6 or 7, and my mom I said, "Mom, why'd you name me Richard?" And she said, "Well, we named you after King Richard the Lionheart because you're a natural leader." I remember her telling me that, right? And it stuck in my head, and that kind of embodied this desire to kind of see what a natural leader looked like. So I think it starts there. And then, of course, when you go into a team like the SEAL teams, you start to recognize when you have such such elite and talented people around you, and if you come into it humbly, you recognize, okay, I have something to give here, but the answers are around me, and the key to performance is me helping enable the talent and the eliteness that's around me versus
Yeah.
try to tell people what to do. You learn that pretty quickly.
So I've written about, and I wrote about it when you were still active duty, which is why I didn't use your name in the Infinite Game book.
Yeah.
But when I talk about trust versus cooperation, I talk about when I asked you the question, who makes it into SEAL Team 6 from the regular SEALs, and
Yeah.
you drew this graph for me of performance versus trust.
Right.
Performance is defined as how good are you at your job, and trust is what kind of person are you. And what you
Yes.
taught me was that clearly nobody wants the low performer of low trust.
Right.
Clearly everybody wants the high performer of high trust on their team. And you learned that it's the high performer of low trust that makes a toxic team member. And you
Yes.
would rather have a medium or low performer of high trust, relative scale and performance there,
Yeah.
on the teams rather than a high performer of low trust. I would argue
Yes.
that policing, there's a million metrics to measure someone's performance, tickets, stops, arrests, whatever, or even just taking a test to make sergeant. That's how you make sergeant in a lot of police forces. You simply take a test. And
Yeah.
yet trust is not evaluated at all. If you look at an average police agency, they may like each other, they may get along, but the question is, do they trust each other? Those numbers are very low. And do they
Yes.
trust leadership? Those numbers are even lower.
Yeah.
So, here, coming from the Navy SEALs, one of the highest performing organizations on the planet, where trust was more important than performance.
Yeah.
How do you take an organization where trust is broken, lacking, needed, regardless of the performance numbers? How do you build trust in an organization where it's not there? And let's assume that senior leadership is not going to do it.
Yeah, what a great and complex question. I think one of the first things we have to do is we have to deconstruct trust a little bit and ask ourselves, what is it that trust is? And trust ultimately are those qualities. Trust ultimately are behaviors. We cannot make somebody trust us. All we can do is behave in a way that allows someone to make a decision to trust us. And those behaviors stem from these qualities. I call them attributes, and I write about them. But these attributes, things like humility, things like open-mindedness, things like empathy, all these attributes imbue and embody behaviors that allow us to say, you know what, Simon, I see you're being empathetic. You're behaving empathetically towards me. You're behaving in a caring way. You're behaving with open-mindedness and humility. I'm going to choose. I'm making a choice to trust you, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And so I think what organizations need to do and teams need to do is they need to first look at what are the qualities that embody the culture. And are those qualities congruent with the same qualities that build trust
Well,
in?
let's go with no.
Okay, let's go with no. So then what we need to do, and I know you're a proponent of this. It's very difficult to turn the Titanic. Okay, but in some cases you can in fact lead up. However, the way you lead up is you have to look at and address and take care of those in your span of care. And so what people can do is they can look at those in their span of care and begin to embody and behave these qualities, these behaviors in a way that models them. We want to model the behavior we want to see more of, and then begin to reward the behavior we want to see more of. What that does is that generates an ecosystem, small at first, but inevitably it's going to be an ecosystem that other people notice. People on the laterals notice, people underneath notice, and ultimately a lot of times people from the tops that look down and say, "Hey, what the heck's going on down there?" Because you build an environment that people want to be a part of, and people feel.
What if someone takes themselves on as a leader, who's not in senior leadership, but sort of mid ranks or below, like wherever
Yeah.
you want to put them, and they take themselves on as a leader, and they choose to take care of the person to the left of them, to the right of them, and we're not just talking in times of danger out in the field, we're talking on a day-to-day basis, and they start to build trust, and the people above start to see those people as threatening because they're starting to create a little, as you called it, an ecosystem of trust around them.
Yeah.
Is there a solution to that, or is somebody putting themselves in a situation where if they really have that quality of leadership that sees them as a threat rather than a help, that is the only option to leave?
Well, it's a tough one, Simon. I mean, there's so many cases of people doing good and being punished for it. And I think this is where courage as an attribute comes in. We have to have the
Yeah,
courage, and this is why leadership is not easy. It's not. No one said it was easy. We have to decide to take the step, do the right thing. There are cases where yes, it may be seen as a threat, and yes, frankly, you may be punished for it. But guess what?
yeah,
If you've made the lives of those in your span of care fulfilling, phenomenal, and trustworthy, those people will stay with you for life.
yeah,
Even if you are drummed out, you will have made friends for life. And you will have made people who are allies and protect and speak for you. And there's no greater gift than that. Because even when we all are on our deathbed at the last throes, we're not going to be we're going to be thinking about those people who are closest to us versus anybody else. So
yeah,
yes, in some cases it may not work out, but I think I'm an optimist, as are you, and I think in most cases you can build a coalition of people who begin to behave and they have that same sense,
yeah,
and that creates a bubble. And a lot of times, even though there's people think there's a threat, that bubble becomes harder and harder to penetrate because it's
yeah.
just so much goodness coming from it.
Yeah. All right, let me take some of the questions from the group here. Can you speak to civilians in policing treated as lower forms or less credible, not being a police officer or a peace officer? I mean, I definitely have thoughts about that. Very often the chief or someone who's in charge will mean it. Will say thank you to those our civilian partners and doing all this. And I think that that's part of it. But I really think that the way that that a team comes together, where civilian and uniformed feel like they're part of the same team, is if those in uniform are the ones saying the thank yous.
So you're 100% correct. And so one of my favorite commanding officers, so in the SEAL teams we had sometimes this issue. You had the Navy, the SEALs, right? We're the guys who go kick the doors. We're on the target. We're on the X, okay? But we don't get to the X without a whole host of support folks. We have intel folks. We have supply folks. We have logistics folks. We have
Both in
admin
uniform and civilian, let's add.
both in uniform and civilians. And I remember this commanding officer said once, he was in front of the whole command. He said, listen, your importance to the target has nothing to do with your proximity to the X. And what he was saying was, I don't care if you're the person in the office doing the admin stuff. You are, as you're running payroll. You are important to the target. You are important to the mission. And what that did was that it gave everybody a sense of ownership and value in the organization.
Yeah.
It also imbued the I guess permission and the desire in a lot of SEALs to say thank you more. And ego is a huge part of this. I mean, we can't, or I say not ego, but arrogance, because I think ego is separate. Ego sometimes gets a bad rap, but arrogance certainly. If anybody is approaching anybody else on a team with arrogance, they're immediately putting themselves on a pedestal and putting someone beneath.
Yeah.
We tried to squelch that as much as possible and make sure everybody understood their value to the mission.
One of the things, and I'm thinking about this, we're talking about that it's the responsibility of the chiefs and it's the responsibility of those in uniform to say thank you to those civilians to help rise up. But now I'm sort of thinking to myself, what can those civilian staff do, if absent some of that?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about an example in private sector where this was the case. And in the specific example it was a big company and it was all the executive assistants who never got any glory for the new
Yeah.
business win, even though they were the ones writing the PowerPoints, for example. And one of the things we realized, and it's kind of like the SEALs and it's kind of like the police, which is the police are out there, the uniformed cops are the ones in uniform, they're visible, and what they do is episodic and sometimes exciting.
Yes.
Making the arrest, the car
Yeah.
chase, preventing the crime, where you have your people who are answering the 911 calls or the dispatch.
Yeah.
That their work is more daily, more constant, and you realize it's that sort of excitement versus and intel in military be the same. Hunting
Yeah.
down bin Laden was years and years and years of just daily intel,
Yes.
and yet
Grind.
the
Grind.
heroes of the few hours of the mission,
Yeah.
who go bash down the doors, and we forget about all those intel folks, who are civilians, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one of the solutions that we found was for all of those groups who feel like second-class citizens, to redefine their own narrative, to take control of their own narrative. And we decided that they were going to call themselves ninjas, which is they operate in the shadows and they get no credit. And yet they're the ones making things happen. And we got everybody ninja pins. And they started to call themselves ninjas. And they took pride in the fact that they were in the shadows. They started to take pride in the fact that they weren't given any credit, you know? And they took pride in the fact that they became silent warriors, that others would get the credit, but you know and I know that that without us it wouldn't have been possible. And so we just, instead of complaining about this reality, we turned that reality, we didn't try and fight against it, we owned it.
Yes, yeah. And identity, I mean, identity is one of the most powerful drivers of human behavior in that case. And if we can form an identity and a meaningful identity around that, which is exactly what happened, then you begin to embody and imbue that.
So I think the civilians in policing need to take control of their own narrative, not worry about how everybody else is treating them.
Yes, and right, as leaders, it's our responsibility. I remember when I was commanding officer of a SEAL squadron, I remember I would go around my command and I had all different, I had maybe 80 or 90 SEALs, and the rest out of the 150, 160 were all support. And I would go around very deliberately and tell people the most important 3 words I could say were, I need you. Because as soon as I told someone I need you
is great.
It's showing vulnerability. It's showing that what they do matters. It's giving them purpose and agency, and saying, "Hey, I can't do what you do. Thank you for what you do." And so we have to, make sure we do that more often. And as the war fighters, because I encourage my SEALs, my team guys to do the same thing. As the war fighters, we need to double down.
That's great. So if you're in uniform, go see your civilian staff, say, we need you. Love that.
Yes.
All right, Rich, we've got a lot of questions. Let's see if we can get through as many of them as possible. Okay, question number 2. I'm 28. I've been a police officer for a bit over 6 years. I'm a doctoral student in leadership studies. What is the most important thing you would tell me as someone who wants to develop into a strong leader in public service?
Yeah.
Okay, Rich, what's your advice to a young leader?
Yeah, the most important thing is being in charge and being a leader are 2 separate things. Being in charge is a position, being a leader is a behavior. Here's the bad news, we don't get to self-designate. We don't get to call ourselves leaders. That's like calling yourself good looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you are someone they want to follow based on the way you behave. So if you want to develop into a strong leader, behave like one. And that will start to allow people to see you as a leader and follow.
I agree with that. And the best way to do it is to do it, right? Which is being young in your career is the university, because the stakes are lower. And as you get promoted and you're given real authority and more scope and scale, the stakes become higher. And so the time to make all the mistakes is when you're young, and own them and be open about it. Hey, I'm learning. Hey, I screwed up. Hey, I'm going to try and do these things. Hey, I'm experimenting with something. I've always been very open when I'm trying new things as a leader.
And that can be practiced both in your professional life and your personal life. You can practice it everywhere.
Jeremy Ashley asks, what are some approaches leaders can take to encourage open communication and trust among team members with differing and sometimes challenging and competitive personalities? That's a very good question.
Yeah, my answer is go first. Because you want to model the behavior. If I'm as a commanding officer of a SEAL squadron, I would get up in front of my squadron, and if something went bad, I would be the first one to say, I screwed up. And this is what I did, and this is what I need to do to fix it, right? You go first in these behaviors. You model the behavior you want to see more of, and then you reward the behavior you want to see more of. So if you see it happen, reward the heck out of it.
One of the things that that I've found that works with difficult personalities or challenging personalities is to change the playing field. So if they're competitive and they're aggressive and they're picking at you, what we usually do is we take the bait and we fight and we defend, and we meet tension with tension, we meet anger with anger, we meet aggression with aggression. And I've found the best way to do to disarm that is to completely change the playing field. Bring humility, bring humor, smile. Point out the absurdity of some of these things, which is like when somebody starts picking at my work, I'll just say with a smile, look, you're 100% right. Yeah. Like I think agreeing, you know what it is? I'll give you a great example. It's like somebody, you can do it either way you want. Something happens on the road, right? You cut somebody off by accident, right? Yeah. And they start flipping you the bird and screaming out the window, right? And if we start screaming back and giving them, the finger back, it's going to escalate because they're starting a fight, they're expecting a fight. And so what I've always found is if they're starting a fight and they're expecting a fight, don't give them one. Regardless of whether I'm at fault or not.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're right.
Yes.
Sorry, you're right.
Yes.
It doesn't
Take
matter.
accountability.
Saying sorry doesn't mean you're wrong.
Right.
Right. And
yes.
so in these situations of difficulty, I always be like, hey, you're right. Totally screwed up there. Human, like you, human, not going to get everything right. Let's move forward because clearly this one little detail is not the thing that's important. Totally hear you. Let's move on. So I think raising the bar, having fun, and raising, not meeting tension with tension. All right, let's take another question. This is from Sean Fontana. Within the SEALs, were exercises done by the unit for calm and mindset before executing an operation, and what were they?
Oh, Sean, I wish I could say there were exercises. I think our training allowed us to do this without doing deliberate exercises. I'm not gonna gap off the question by that, but let me because there are things I will suggest. However, I will say one of the things that we did to maintain calm and a good mindset is we really planned, but we didn't worry about that which we couldn't control. Okay, you can't nitnoid the details. We focused on what we could control in the moment. We had a couple of plans if something went wrong, but we didn't overanalyze it or suffer paralysis through analysis. So planning, proper planning, but also not worrying about anything but what you can control in the moment. In terms of exercises, there's a lot of great science out there now. There's breathing you can do, even just box breathing. You may have heard of it. That's basically you're breathing in for maybe a 5 count, you're holding on top for a 5 count, you're breathing out for a 5 count, and then you're holding on the bottom for a 5 count. It's called box breathing. That can maintain your autonomic arousal state. So you stay right where you need to be, kind of in the pocket of alertness, but not going overboard. Okay. You can also de-emphasize. You can bring down autonomic arousal through what's called a physiological sigh, where you do a nice big deep breath to the very top, do another short one to get really as much in your lungs as possible, and do a nice slow exhale that has been shown to decrease autonomic arousal, get yourself into a more calm state. So look up breathing exercises. There's also visual tools that you can look up as well.
I did a podcast with Lee Carlson. I would recommend listening to that. Lee is a world champion free diver.
Yes.
And she talks about what makes free diving work is not the amount of oxygen you can get in your blood. You can't get more oxygen in your blood, right? Like you take do an oxygenator, you're at 98%, you can't go to 100, it doesn't exist.
Right.
And she says what makes it work is not the amount of air you can get in. That's just breathing exercises, anyone can learn it. It's managing panic. She goes, because if you're at depth and you panic, you die. If you're at depth and you freak out, you die. If you're at depth and you have sort of any kind of second thoughts, you die.
Yeah.
And so she says everything about her sport is managing stress, and the way she manages stress is through breathing. And it's not the inhale. When people say take a deep breath, no. It's not the inhale. It's the exhale. Yes. It's the amount of carbon dioxide you can get out that reduces stress.
Yes, and it's funny. So a good friend of mine is Andrew Huberman. I know, Simon, you know this, but Andrew and I talk about this all the time. And what stresses the system? You learn this in the SEALs. What stresses your system is the CO2 buildup. It's not the lack of oxygen.
There you go.
So you recognize you can actually push past that. But blowing out CO2, which is what the
long exhales.
Blowing out CO2 will de-stress. Yeah.
There we go. So go listen to Lee Carlson's podcast. It was a really, really, really insightful. Okay, got another question here from Alex Leone. Thank you both for inspiring insights. My question is about the intersection of leadership and personal history, specifically trauma. In your research, have you found any evidence or observation regarding how a leader's trauma history might shape or influence their leadership style, resilience, or approach to building trust with their team?
Yeah, I haven't researched this, but it makes 100% sense to me. And I can probably think of several leaders who I know had interesting upbringings or interesting backgrounds, and their leadership style was affected by that. I think what we have to understand about leadership is we're not leading machines, we're not leading equipment. We manage machines, we manage equipment. We lead people, we lead human beings, which means regardless of our backgrounds, we have to understand that our behaviors are what are going to cause people to want to follow us. And if you don't behave in a way that people want to follow you, you can be in the highest position in the agency or the unit, and people don't want to follow you. I remember having this experience. I'd look at someone in a hierarchical position above me, and I'd look at that person and say I wouldn't follow that person anywhere. And meanwhile, I'd look at someone over here with no hierarchical position whatsoever, I would say I would follow that person to hell and back. So yes, trauma can affect how we lead, but it's our responsibility if we desire to be a leader to just behave and not let the trauma affect us negatively.
Trauma is an event. It's our response to the event that matters. There is post-traumatic stress. We know what that is. And there's also post-traumatic growth, which we don't talk about enough.
Yeah.
And sometimes trauma is a springboard to something good, and sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
And this is what trauma management is. You know, it's learning how to understand the role that the trauma plays in our lives and not be a victim of that trauma, but understand that it's part of our story.
Yeah.
And it's what we do with it and how we leverage it later in life that becomes something. And Rich, you and I have seen people who've gone through things that it's amazing that they came through it mentally strong, but they chose not to have it define them. They chose to just have it be a part of their story.
Yeah, yeah, and again, the physiological way I've talked about this is there's distress and there's eustress, and distress is this strain, physiological or psychological strain that is defined as harmful for the user, and eustress is that physiological or mental strain that's been defined as beneficial. Now we all understand what eustress is because any of us who go to the gym and lift weights put our bodies under eustress. We literally rip our muscles and then let them recover so they may grow. What's interesting about what you said, Simon, and I think can hammer home this point, is we can actually turn distress into eustress based on our ability to look at it and reframe it in an appropriate way and ask ourselves, what can I learn? How can I grow? It comes with a warning, which I want to make sure, because Simon and I have both obviously been friends and known people who have not survived or gone well with this stuff. If you are having trouble with trauma and you cannot, it's difficult for you to reframe it by yourself, get help. Get help. There's many people, many organizations that can help you. We can't always do this alone. So if you have that type of stress or trauma and it's hard for you to reframe it, please, please, please ask someone, find someone, get help.
I'll go a step further, Rich. I don't think anyone can do it alone. I don't think
Yeah.
there's a single person on the planet that can manage that kind of stress or any kind of stress alone. This is why friendship, camaraderie, collegiality, team ethic, esprit de corps, why these things matter so much. So long as you have one person in your life who says, I got your back, you'll have the courage to take that on. But I don't think there's a single person on the planet with the internal fortitude to do it all by themselves. You don't need to have, sometimes we have experts who help us, but simply having a friend who's willing to sit in the mud with us, sometimes that's all we need. But
Yes.
I don't think anyone has the ability to do it alone. So no one should ever try.
Okay, good. I agree.
As a 31-year-old veteran, this is from Sean Riley, of law enforcement, and currently the deputy chief of operations for a mid-sized agency, about 135 sworn in Massachusetts, production, as you said, is always a metric that is historically been used to tell our mayor or city councils how we are doing. I'm interested in your thoughts on changing the narrative of value. What value does someone bring to the agency and the community's mission? I wrote about this. There's a police agency in Colorado called Castle Rock Police Force, Police Department in Castle Rock, Colorado, led by Jack Cawley. I wrote a whole case study about it in The Infinite Game. And Jack raised in the system, Chief Cawley raised in the system of arrests, tickets, and this is how you report value. And unfortunately, that's all anybody cares about, is like evaluating the quality of a child just based on their grades, where clearly we know there's more to kids than just their grades. And so he said, we'll track that stuff, of course, but we're not going to present it as the most important thing. And he started tracking problems solved. And so he would reward his cops, not because they made more arrests. He would highlight and do both informal and formal recognition and reward structures for those who solved problems, which may have led to fewer traffic stops, which may have led to fewer arrests because the problem was solved. And so you get the behavior you reward. So if we only reward those traditional metrics, that's going to be the focus. But if we reward new things, you're gonna put the focus on those things. And you do have to build a narrative to those city councilmen and those the city councilors and those mayors, that if you want to be the hero mayor, telling people how many tickets we wrote, there's no necessarily direct correlation to the problems you're trying to solve. But if you let us solve problems of crime and things like this and finding creative ways of which our cops know how to do it, we will report that to you and you can own that stuff. Let me give you those narratives. So it's about helping those people who we report to help them change their narrative as well, because they've only ever known the traditional metrics.
And by the way, when you do that, the community that you serve becomes the champion of you as well. That shows your value. So.
Robert Brinton asks, how do you build trust in police organizations that have multiple layers and hundreds of people? Seems like I'm writing this, the conversation between the two is touching some of this. Okay. So when you're many people deep and there's trust issues throughout.
Yes. Yeah.
What do we do?
So he said, he's correct. As he's probably writing it as we were talking about, manage your sphere first. Do what you can with your sphere first. Create that bubble of trust, and then as you create that bubble of trust, it will hopefully and likely proliferate both laterally and vertically. I think but if you can, at least at a minimum, if you can create a sphere of trust and fulfillment and happiness with who you have, that alone is going to bring you happiness and fulfillment. Let alone the fact that it'll likely proliferate. So
I'm fond of saying, be the leader you wish you had.
Yeah.
As much as Rich and I wish this was possible, no number of anonymously sent books will change how anybody leads. You can keep trying, but it's not going to work. And so, as Rich said, to take responsibility for the people and the environment in which you actually have some control, whether it's up, down, left, or right. You can lead up, you can lead down, you can lead sideways, but control the stuff you can control. And it sounds. Don't worry about what everybody else is doing. And what you start to see, and we've talked about this, what you start to see is this pocket works. And then somebody from that group gets promoted or moves out to a different group, and they bring everything they've learned because they loved working in this group. They now lead the way we want people to lead over here. And we take an infinite mindset that we're going to solve this problem, but we may not solve it on an arbitrary time frame. And then somebody from there gets promoted out. And before you know it, the tail wags the dog.
And by the way, the line to get, as people leave that group, the line to get in that group increases because everybody wants to be part of that team.
I'll tell you a quick real life story. Not to belabor the point, but I'll tell you a real story. I did a gig for Microsoft many, many years ago, and there's this very small team that had a relatively small budget, like $9 or $10 million, and they did a big culture exercise. And this is what we did. And everything you and I are talking about is we said, don't worry about everything else, worry about yourselves. And they started doing it. And corporate was impressed, the work quality was going up, the innovation was going up, and their budget blew up very quickly to like 90 million, like they got really successful. But the thing that none of us expected, the unintended byproduct, is the phone was ringing off the hook from all across Microsoft. How do I get into this team? Yeah. And we didn't understand how that was happening because it's this little under the radar team that, except for big corporate, nobody even knows it exists. What we found out was when team members went out for lunch with their friends, with other team members, and they would just talk about the day, the group, the members from this group were like, oh, I love my job, I love my team, I love my boss. And word was getting out that everybody wanted on this team. So that's one of the nice metrics. If you're getting it right, everybody wants in.
Yeah.
Okay, another question here. I'm going to try and get through as many of these as possible. Chuck Crosby asks, in reflecting on the attributes you wrote about, so this is for you, Rich, how do you challenge police leaders to invest in developing those attributes? How do we get around the Dunning and Kruger's curve, where a police leader stops saying, yep, I check the box, and start investing in developing those critical attributes? So how do we move from a check the box system of leadership to actually developing attributes when we have leaders who are closed-minded to the things we want to bring into this organization?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chuck. And I think that, in some of the police teams and police agencies and organizations that we've worked with, one of the things that we do first is we help them define and understand what that list of attributes looks like, because that's really clear. It really has to be clear. It's often that we assume we know, or we assume we think we know, and unless we do the diligence, say, hey, what are the attributes that are most important to us, i.e., the most critical in our roles as police officers? Make sure that list is clear, and then begin to look at everybody in terms of that list and say, how are we actually behaving? How are we showing up in terms of those attributes? So a great example is empathy. And I always say, empathy is one of those attributes that, whereas you might not need a lot of empathy as a SEAL, you certainly need empathy as a police officer, right? So it's why maybe a Navy SEAL might not make a great cop, right? Because you might not have enough empathy. But if empathy is that attribute, we need to say, hey, we are going to prioritize empathy. And we're going to start looking at those who actually show empathy in terms of their ability to police in effective ways. And then that begins to show a focus on what you're looking for, but it also, in a very elemental and simple way, begins to highlight where there might be gaps. And as soon as you can highlight where there might be gaps in a simple, effective way, leadership tends to say, okay, now we need to invest in those gaps because it's very clear. That's the thing about these attributes and these qualities. They're very difficult to articulate sometimes because we just kind of feel them. They're just kind of out there. And so as soon as we get some language around this, it becomes much easier.
I want to double click on something you said there. SEALs don't have a lot of empathy. They may not make great police officers, right? Which is, I think, too often we conflate military culture and police culture and think that they're the same
Yes.
because there's a gun involved,
Mm-hmm.
there's occasional violence included, like that they're this, and they're completely different.
Completely
And the
different.
more
Yeah.
I've worked with the military and the more I've worked with police, we need to stop making those comparisons.
Yeah.
And the police need to stop as a culture aspiring to be like the military,
Right.
showing up in camouflage in a city. It looks cool. Camouflage is designed to make you blend into the environment. It's just silly,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it also is scary. It can actually,
It's also scary. It can also have to count
fear.
exactly because
Yeah.
it starts to look paramilitary.
Yes.
And
Yes.
policing organizations need to stop referring to themselves as paramilitary organizations.
Right.
They are not paramilitary
Yeah.
organizations. They have paramilitary capabilities,
Yes.
but
Yes.
they are
Yeah.
not paramilitary organizations. And the sort of like, it's like trying to be like the military is counter to what we need police to be in polite society and sometimes
Yes.
impolite society.
Now I will
And
add
I think
though.
police need to own. I think
Yeah.
police need to take more ownership as to what they want their culture to be, and it should be completely unique from military, even though some aspects may overlap.
Yes, and I would say where the responsibility lies in just identifying where some similarities lie and where vast non-similarities lie. I will concede that your SWAT HRT folks do in many cases some of the same jobs that we did as SEALs when we're running into buildings, rescuing hostages, things like that. So some of those capabilities are similar. However, there are many aspects of policing, even with those SWAT guys and those HRT guys, that they have to bring into the equation that Navy SEALs don't even have to worry about. And it's a whole different thing. I mean, our whole thing as SEALs is we want to be invisible. We want to basically do a job and be like ghosts. Police is completely the opposite. I mean, you have to be visible. In fact, part of the job is to be visible and be visible in the right way. So yes, start being very more precise about what those aspects are that you should and can learn from the
Yeah.
military, but be also honest and precise about no, that's unlike us, and we need to actually have our own unique thing.
And you work in units. Cops usually work as ones and twos,
Yes, yeah,
So it's a
yeah,
completely different animal.
yeah,
Okay, moving on. Uh, this is coming up a little too much, but let's take it on again. And when I say a
yeah.
little too much, meaning, when a question keeps being asked, it means it's a thing. And so this is the next question, Rich, is a big question because I think it plagues policing. And this is
Yes.
why the curve is taking on culture and leadership head on, because we recognize that that is the opportunity to change policing for the better in America. The question from Angela is, what is the best strategy for dealing with toxic staff members who are not open to positive culture in change, positive culture change?
Yeah. All right, Angela. So when it comes to toxicity in teams, there are a few. I wouldn't say there's a huge amount, which is good news, but I think arrogance is a huge one, and perhaps at least disordered narcissism. And what I had to recognize, and this took me a while to learn, Angela. I didn't know it right away. Was that dealing with this actually involved a strategy I did not anticipate, and that is arrogance used to just piss me off insanely. It was a trigger for me. until I was having lunch with one of my buddies who's a really high top performer, athlete, chess player, and we were talking about this, and he said, you know, when I see arrogance, I immediately think insecurity. And then it clicked for me. I said, wait a second, arrogance is insecurity. And so what I decided to do was start approaching this stuff with empathy. Empathy first, okay? So in other words, where might this toxic behavior be coming from? This toxic behavior might be coming from an environment that is completely absent of trust. And so the solution may be to double down on building a trusted environment. The arrogance is likely coming from a place of insecurity. Why might this person feel like they have to show themselves the way they are and purport themselves the way they are? Approach that way first and see if you can figure out the problem that way. However, I will say, and I will also concede that if after approaching it that way, the problem can't be solved, then it might be time to offer that person up to the competition. Arrogance will kill a team, and we have to understand that. So if the empathetic solution, if the environmental solution doesn't work, you may have to look at solutions to extract that person. There were people that I had to end up extracting from the organization because they just did not, their problem was not environmental, it was themselves, and they couldn't get over it. So that's how I'd answer that one.
You know, for us, it's always been, is someone coachable? It's that they're showing up as arrogant isn't the challenge, but if they prove to themselves to be uncoachable, then we like to donate them to our competition. One of the things that I've learned, and it happens at every level of an organization, at high levels and low levels, is how we create a narrative around a person. So when you get senior leaders together, for example, they'll start saying, that person's lazy, that person's stupid. And all it takes is one senior person. Everybody's, oh yeah, you know, here we go again, you know, Joe Lazy, right? And it happens down in the rank and file as well, where they label a leader toxic, evil, angry, you know? Like I remember I went out for a walk with a friend and she wanted some advice and she started her sentence with, my boss is a horrible person. And I said, oh my God, does she mistreat her kids and kick her dog? And she said, no. I said, okay, so we don't know that she's a horrible person. What we do know is that she's a horrible boss. And those are very different things. And so one of the things that I've done with my team, and I say I want it at senior levels, I want it at junior levels. If somebody starts with a narrative about who someone is, what their character is, anyone on the team has to interrupt it and say, that person could be lazy, or they could be struggling, or we could have put them in a position where they don't know what they're doing, or there might be something going on in their lives. So lazy's on the list for sure. Or that boss could be toxic, or that's all they've ever known and they've only worked in toxic organizations and that's how you get ahead and that's how they got their job, so they don't know any different. Or they're insecure, or they're afraid of losing their job and so they're doubling down on arrogance just to protect themselves and the fear that they're going to lose their job. And when you start to just put more things on the list, you actually treat people differently. As Rich was saying, you start to show up with empathy. So if someone is difficult, if a boss is really angry in a meeting unnecessarily, and our rule of thumb is if the response is above a 5, it's about something else. You know, like when you're at home and your spouse yells at you, like, why are you leaving the fridge open again? It's like, that seems a little high for an open fridge. Probably not about the fridge. Right?
What else did I do?
So if a person in a leadership position is particularly aggressive, it's okay in private to go to them and be like, hey, boss, do you have a minute? I'm worried about you. You were really aggressive with us in the meeting, more than seemed necessary for the subject. I just wanted to see if you're okay. And having that level of empathy, even if it doesn't go well the first time, because they may be unused to having that, they may be mistrustful of it. But if you just stick with it and the feelings are genuine, like if you genuinely care about what's going on for this person, relatively quickly, you'll see that armor starts to come down and they start to be more open. So always put more things on the list.
And I will say, just as a leader and having been a leader, leadership can sometimes be a very lonely position. It can be very lonely in terms of how you feel like and who you can relate to. So something like that, something like this, a behavior that Simon just described, would in 9.99 times out of 10 be very appreciated. So
yeah, here's a good one, and I'm curious your answer. I have an answer. I'm curious yours. How do you build trust when there's a culture of investigations and throwing people anonymously under the bus to survive?
Ooh, yeah. How do you build trust? I almost want to hear you first because I've never heard this question asked this way. So
Okay,
why don't
so
you go first on this one?
so uh, my rule on tension, because that's what this is,
Yeah.
you know, is always make the implicit explicit.
Hmm.
Say, hey, we have a culture where we are filing investigations against each other and making anonymous accusations to take people down or lift ourselves up. And this cannot work long term, but let's just put it out there. This is our culture. Is
Hmm.
this the culture we all want to live in? I'm not
Yeah.
saying, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not saying I even know how to fix it. But I've always a great believer, instead of all the, because we have these conversations private with our allies at lunch. But I'm a great believer in being very open. Make the implicit explicit, and it takes the air out of it, and it
Yeah.
puts it on the table.
Yeah, I would 100% agree, and I would say that in addition to that, or to help emphasize that, communication is always the one of the single biggest factors or distinguishing factors of a high performing team. Is you have communication is abundant and purposeful, and so I think what you're saying, Simon, is to get communication and transparency out on the table, so you maybe can start building a high performing team.
I'm just reading the questions. Um, so one of the questions says, has there been some peer-reviewed research to Simon's claims that trust among officers and law enforcement is behind, and other statements made, anecdotal castings seem to be emotional and not factual? This is what I do, and talk to enough police in policing agencies and compare it to other organizations. And the fact is, even coming up in here, the questions are about toxicity, the questions are about lack of trust, the questions, we know how police very often are promoted. They're not promoted whether they exhibit the qualities of good leadership. They're very often promoted because they passed a test. And just look at the way in which trust exists inside police forces, and look at the way that trust exists between policing organizations and the outside community. And we have to acknowledge that there is a problem. And when I've sat down with police of various sizes across the whole country, and we've gone through like, what are all the problems with policing in America today? What we find out is that the root cause of almost all those problems is leadership and culture. And so it has not been peer reviewed, except for all of the police that I've talked to who go, yes, this is my experience, they say, in my entire career. So I do believe that there is a challenge in policing, and I do believe that we have to take it on wholeheartedly. And I for one, don't believe we need to wait for a quantitative study to be done before we address the problem. If somebody wants to go do it, great. It'll just be additional fodder for us as we move forwards. This point, okay, this is an anonymous, this point is glib. Thank yous to civilians. It's from the members with badges or brass. You're a great resource, just like toilet paper and laptops, etc. Let's talk about this. So one of the things that I've learned about leadership, so somebody here is saying that simply saying thank you to civilians as a great resource is treating them like toilet paper and laptops, which are also great resources. I think it's like anything, right? Which is, if the gratitude is genuine, why would we question someone's words? Which is, I understand that sometimes we have the solutions exist on both sides. And what you find very often is both sides sit with their arm folded, go, you fix it, right? And sort of civilians will say, come on, police leaders, you fix it. And then are cynical to anything that comes their way from a police leader who's trying to fix it, because they don't like the choice of words, for example. But I would ask, if we believe the intention, if we believe the intention is genuine, is it not our responsibility to at least give that person the benefit of the doubt to try and solve our problem? Like, we have to be a part of the solution. The only way you're going to truly fix any tension between uniformed and civilian members of a policing organization is if both say, we would like to fix this. And if only one side says, we're in, and the other side says, F you, bad news, it's not going to work. That's like, you can't fix a broken marriage if only one partner wants to fix the marriage. Like, you can only fix a broken marriage if both partners go, this is going to suck, and some things are going to trigger me, some things I'm not going to like, but I'm in. But if one spouse keeps questioning the words used by the other spouse, it's never going to work. And so I will say that part of the responsibility of fixing the relationship between uniformed and civilian is both have to be in on wanting to fix it. And picking at each other's words, it's just not helpful to what we're trying to get for ourselves.
Yeah, I would also though add, I'm going to double down on what you said in terms of the genuineness of the compliment of the thank you. Even just the words "thank you," if said genuinely to a person, is going to have an impact. I've seen it experientially many times. So you can say anything if it's a genuine, really thought from feeling and thoughtful recognition. It's meaningful. It's meaningful to that human being.
And if it's a new leader, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And if it's a leader that's been there, what I would recommend for that person is to be explicit about what you're doing. To say, hey, I have not been very good at being inclusive of our civilian brothers and sisters. I need to do better. And I'm taking myself on, and you're going to see me experimenting with new things, so that when you get that thank you from someone, so when you get that you're a great, we can't do this without you, that you understand that they're being honest, that they're taking themselves on, and it's not just something to be looked at with suspicion because the behavior and the words are different. So if you are the person in uniform who's going to start saying thank you, just be explicit. Just say, I realize I haven't said thank you, and I realize that I couldn't do my job without you, and I realize I need to be better. And so be explicit if your behavior or your words is going to vary from what people are used to, because that will breed cynicism. And so in defense of that civilian cynicism, if the words are just suddenly different out of the blue, they should be met with cynicism because we don't know what people are doing. So if you're going to be somebody who's trying something different so as to avoid the cynicism, please be explicit about what you're trying to do new, because then the cynicism is real.
Yeah, totally agree.
Moving on. Here's one from Lewis. Malachowski, I think. Malzowski. As the top leader, the chief, how would you handle a situation where another leader, a sergeant, was doing harm by undermining the leadership with others?
Yeah, that's
a common one.
That's a common one. Well, the first thing I would do if I were taken into the team, this team's aspect, is I would have a sit down with that particular leader, that sergeant, or in our case, maybe the team leader or the troop chief, because I need to understand what's going on in their sphere that is causing that type of behavior. And because if I don't understand that, I can't solve the problem, because so that'd be the first thing I do. I would also then likely see if I could find other sergeants or other team leaders and get their perspective on what might be going on, because what might be going on it might be invisible to me at my position, but completely transparent to people in that sergeant level position. So I would say I'd have to do a lot of information gathering, but this is toxic behavior and cannot, in fact, go on. If I could not figure out what was going on and solve the problem, I would have to, and have, in some cases, removed that person, because that is a toxic team member. If you're undermining leadership. In fact, I have stories, I have examples. One of my good friends was a troop chief. And it was one of his low moments overseas. He undermined a leader by disobeying an order. He was fired and sent home from deployment. That is a huge deal, but that's it cannot be tolerated if it can't be sussed out and figured out. So,
I think also, going back to one of the conversations we had a moment ago, which is changing the playing field. In other words, if you have a sergeant that's trying to undermine you behind the scenes, do not work behind the scenes to try and undermine them.
Right.
Right? Um, Engage, as Rich said. Sit down with them and be like, hey, what's going on? You know, come on, what's going on? Like, how do you and I solve this? Like, tell me what your issue is with me. And I think part of what good leadership is learning how to listen, and let someone empty their bucket. The best example is that I've seen of this ever done, what I would call extreme listening, is Dia Khan. Dia Khan is a BAFTA-winning documentary maker. She's a Muslim woman living in the UK. She made some statements about multicultural society that gained traction in the white supremacist community to the point where they started trolling her so much that the police advised her to stay away from windows. The way she responded was, instead of staying away from windows, is she moved to the United States and started engaging with white supremacists. And she doesn't endorse or affirm their points of view, but she did offer them a safe space to feel heard. And she built trust with them to the point where they could no longer reconcile their racist points of view with the fact that they considered this Muslim woman a friend, and they dropped out of the white supremacist movement. It's an extreme example of what extreme listening looks like. And so if you have a sergeant who's undermining you, there's something going on there, obviously. Give them an opportunity to feel heard. That doesn't mean correct their facts. Remember, it's their story and it's their narrative. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. And they may not want to engage with you immediately, but to give them an opportunity to vent and tell you all the things they think about you without repercussions, without getting in trouble, and without you correcting them, and without you responding and saying, well, this is about you. And let them get it all out. And remember, listening is not something that you accomplish it's not an event. It's a process. Like, you can't have one sit-down session and fix a marriage, right? There's a process of rebuilding and reestablishing trust. And to Rich's point, if someone proves to be uncoachable, if someone proves to, for whatever bee they've got on their bonnet, at some point, if it's untenable, then sometimes they have no role in the organization. Those to me are not the first choices, though. Removing somebody from the organization is not the first choice, because you want to be able to say that you exhausted all possibilities and gave the benefit of the doubt. In other words, I'm a great believer in hiring slowly and firing slowly.
Yeah. Well, if you haven't changed the environment, someone else is going to come in. If you put a pickle in or you put a cucumber in a pickle jar, it's going to pickle, right? So if you don't change the environment, then the next person coming in will become the pickle.
And sometimes saying, look, we're going to go through a culture change. There's going to be some bumpy roads. It's going to be new stuff. It's going to be unfamiliar. It's going to be uncomfortable. But we have to remember we're all going through this discomfort together. Like going to the gym hurts for a while until you start to build a little bit of strength. Right. Culture change is exactly the same. You're going to see the metrics go down. You're going to see cynicism and trust go up in the short term until people realize that this is for real. And I'm a great believer in making very public statements, which is, you do not have to agree with this or like this, but you may not sabotage it. If you want to just come to work, do a good day's work, clock in and clock out, I have no beef with you. I will not bug you. If you think this stuff is stupid, as long as you're just doing good work and you just want to do your job, I will leave you alone. But the minute you try to sabotage, now we're going to have a problem. So I don't expect everyone to want to buy into it. I just expect people to just not sabotage it. And that, I think, is a perfectly, like, if someone's worried about losing their job is safe. Just do good work and you'll get paid. But you may not sabotage. That is not allowed. And I'm a great believer in just be very explicit about those conditions. And what you'll start to see is, over time, believe it or not, those people may be slow to adopt, but they do eventually adopt, because otherwise they feel left out of all the new camaraderie that's happening.
Yeah.
Let's take a couple more questions. I mean, going to the question before about, have there been any studies done about whether we need change in policing cultures or not? I mean, yet another question. How do you manage someone who is actively looking for ways to discredit you as a manager?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, engage, I believe, make the implicit explicit publicly, and engagement. Remember, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, like I believe in world peace. That doesn't mean I believe in a world without conflict. I just believe in a world in which we can resolve conflict peacefully.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, and the highest performing teams use conflict all the time. It just, you look at it differently. Conflict is not to hurt or harm. Conflict is used to grow. And so in the SEAL teams, the feedback loop was very rapid, sometimes instantaneous. That feedback loop was sometimes harsh, but we knew and we understood that it was to keep us alive and to keep us getting better. And so
yeah.
and that's conflict. So conflict was not looked at the same way.
David Franklin, just thank you for your comment here. Moving from output measures to outcome measures has been done in my agencies, and it's a good way to discuss with elected officials. So there's a great example of how that has worked. So thank you for that comment. How does an agency, this is from Adnan, how does an agency measure their success? Currently, it does not feel that our agency measures in any capacity. I'm attempting to more accurately reflect case closures and use this as a metric to measure an organization's success. What are your thoughts? So I'm a great believer in asymmetrical metrics and new metrics. And believe it or not, I think the best way to do that is engage the people who are being measured, right? So you always have your traditional metrics. The amount of emphasis you put on them is up to you. Like you're still going to measure arrests, but just devalue them. Don't promote based on them. Don't reward based on them. And ask your own cops, like, what do you consider a good day? Like, what matters? How can we measure that? How would you like me to measure your success, in whatever job you have, civilian or uniformed? And I think as the police leader, like, you get to make the final decisions as to what to recognize and reward, but let people get involved in new ways. If you literally come out and say, we measure things, we measure all the wrong things. We measure the things that are easy to measure, and we don't measure the things that are difficult to measure, even though the things that are difficult to measure matter more, like trust versus performance. Use Rich's trust versus performance graph.
Matrix.
Use that narrative, which is we're great at measuring performance, we're terrible at measuring trust, and trust really matters. What are ways in which we can measure our success as a policing organization other than arrests and citations? So,
but just to double down on
engage.
something you said is the first thing that has to happen is you must define success. You have to define what you want to, what does success look like? Because a lot of times we assume it's these metrics we can measure and put numbers around, but what does success look like? What is it? How do we define it? And then once you define it, okay, how can we then measure it?
And I think going back to law enforcement, if you define yourself as law enforcement and you call yourself as law enforcement, your metrics are going to be all about enforcing law. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of that term as defining of a category. Let's call us the profession of policing. We are police, we're in the profession of policing. We will take ownership over our culture that is going to be different from military or other organizations. It'll be our own, even if we can learn from them. And if the purpose of police is to protect the vulnerable from harm, how will we measure protecting the vulnerable from harm? If our mission is to preserve life, preserve peace, and preserve property in that order, you can break the peace to protect a life, and you can break property to preserve the peace in that order. Then how should we measure the success of those things? So if we have purpose to protect the vulnerable from harm, if we have mission, preserve life, preserve peace, preserve property in that order, what are the metrics that we can use to ensure that we are advancing those things? Ask your own cops. But if you define yourself as law enforcement, you're going to look for law enforcement measurements.
And like Jack's was to solve problems, right?
To solve problems. That was Jack's, to solve problems, exactly. Okay, let's keep moving. How do we enlighten the political leaders who appoint the police leadership on the importance of these issues and discussions? I think that's the reason language matters. It's one of the reasons the curve exists. We need to start using this language out loud, and we are talking as much to those civilian leaders as we are to police leaders and policing organizations.
Yes, agreed.
Okay, here's one for you, Rich. Isn't donating to our competition a myopic way of solving the problem for your own organization? but keeping the problem within the industry. This is already systemic within policing, where the problem officers are allowed to jump from department to department, disappointed to hear such a flippant solution being offered up. My
Yeah, I
attitude
would.
is get them out of policing.
Well, so yeah, I don't, I would disagree with the fact that police officers and police agencies compete with other police officers, police agencies. Competition is completely outside of policing. So I would say that that's how I would define that. It's not about moving them into another police officer or policing situation. That's not your competition. You shouldn't be competing against other police officers. So what's another industry? What's another place they can go?
But
Oftentimes,
at the end of the day, I understand that the question, which is we're just moving our leaves to the neighbor's yard. We're not actually getting rid of the leaves, right?
yeah,
Uh,
but I would say this, if we do this responsibly, and this is what I had to do, I had to learn, is if I understand why someone is not a fit for my team or organization, if I've done the diligence on that and done the work, I can effectively move that person on with more knowledge about themselves and even with recommendations on where their unique performance
yeah.
fingerprint, their unique performance profile would actually allow them to excel. We're not talking about bad people here. There are bad people, and those bad people we should just get rid of, and we should jail them. Okay, so but most of these people, majority, aren't bad people. They are just not people who fit in whatever organization we're talking about. So doing the diligence on understanding what that person's strengths are and allowing them the opportunity and helping them figure out where they actually might fit outside of that is going to create allies, not enemies. And you can actually fire people and create allies, not enemies, if you do the diligence in that
I get Abe's point, and I think he's right on. And I think and he says it's systemic, right? Which is we know that sometimes when these cops who are eventually arrested for significant crimes, what we discover is that they've got histories of complaints against them, histories of behavioral challenges, and very often have moved from agency to agency because one agency didn't want to deal with them. They moved to another agency. Sometimes they quit before they get fired, so it doesn't show up on their record. We know that happens. And we know that there's an open secret where there's this whole shell game of moving, it happens in education as well, where we just move the bad ones around until they do something so bad that they get caught and somebody gets hurt. But how do we deal with them before we get to that breaking point? And I think this is a question for policing writ large as a profession, which is what systemic changes do we have to make that allows us as a category, as a profession, to remove these people from the system and not move them from place to place? Like, what changes must be made? And how do police agencies take responsibility for that? Because it can be done legislatively. But how can policing agencies take responsibility and maybe and help each other with this kind of stuff, as opposed to just dumping a problem on somebody else? Because I think Abe's point is a very good one. It's a systemic, and I think much more needs to be done as a profession. So thank you, Abe. You're right. As a new leader in an org, in the first 90 days, what's the best way to understand culture and where different team leads stand? Okay, Rich, you're a new leader in an org. First 90 days, how are you going to understand the culture?
I am going to shut up and listen. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to listen and learn as much as I can. I can't tell you how many great leaders I had who they came into positions of command, and man, you're like, man, this person is so, I think the world of this person. They're awesome. They have a huge history, background, tactical stuff, all this stuff. And because they're great leaders, the first 90 days, they would just walk around and they'd listen and they'd learn. That's all they do. They wouldn't dictate. They wouldn't direct. They wouldn't, throw down commandments. They would first listen and learn. And that's what you learn in the SEAL teams as an officer coming into the SEAL teams. You are jumping into this environment and it's a bunch of pipe hitters who know what they're doing. I'm going to listen first.
I completely agree. I've got nothing. The company Chanel has a rule that if you're a newly hired senior leader, that you're not allowed to speak in meetings for the first 90 days. They say, we know you're smart. You don't have to prove it to us. We hired you. We know. And now shut up and listen and learn our culture and learn how we do things. And then when, after 90 days, we're looking for suggestions, we're looking for improvements, we're looking for things that we may not see about ourselves because you're an outsider looking in. So yeah, I completely agree with Rick and with Rich, and please be vocal about it. Say, I'm new here. I don't pretend that I know everything. I'm gonna speak less and listen more. You won't hear from me for I might ask a few questions for clarification, but I'm here to listen and learn about this organization before I think I can contribute. So just be very open about what your strategy is so people know that you're just not a bump on a log sitting in that meeting.
Yeah, that's right.
What else? Do you think we should learn these concepts earlier in our life? Maybe we should start having these discussions and learning process in college or even earlier. God, yes.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, oh, please, yes. And
Yes.
at police academy too, and in
Well,
college,
yeah.
and in high school. God, please, yes.
So we're just so you know, just to make sure you know that we're on that path. Even our organization is starting to work with some high schools and some middle schools to get them some curriculum on attributes and these qualities so they can start to understand what these qualities mean in their lives. Not to judge them or to label them, but to understand what things like humility and patience and situation awareness, all these things are, so that we can indoctrinate kids earlier on into the process and build positive and healthy habits of introspection.
I also realized I got a little defensive on the question about peer-reviewed, studies versus all the anecdotal stuff. I mean, the answer is yes. Look, at the end of the day, any studies that are done will benefit and help us on the road. But I'm also a great believer in let's jump in and start trying to fix the problem ourselves. If we recognize that there's a problem, let's work to fix it immediately and allow the studies to come in and to support us.
And I will add, Simon, because I know you know this too, recognize the pockets that exist where this is working beautifully, the pockets of trust, the pockets of agency, the pockets of goodness. There are a lot of them in current policing. Let's highlight those and let's ask them, hey, what are they doing, and see if we can proliferate that stuff. There's a lot of awesome, good work being done, and there's a lot of trust out there too. But let's get those things highlighted so we can all learn from it and become better.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, we do need data because anecdotal alone can be dangerous on both sides of the equation.
That's right.
Rich, it looks like we're winding down. There was one question here that was asked that's sort of just kind of unrelated. It's a little sideways, but I thought I'd ask it. What's your favorite nonfiction book?
Currently, my favorite nonfiction book is *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari.
I heard him speak recently about how we hold social media companies accountable. And you don't hold them accountable for the things that people say on their platforms. You hold them accountable for the algorithm that they've built that allows abhorrent behavior to be promoted. And so there is accountability for the algorithm that they build. So I kind of really like that. He's pretty amazing. Thank you very much. Oh, mine has always been Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Thank you for being a part of the solution. Thank you for helping us promote what positive policing looks like in a society. Thank you for being the leaders you wish you had. I know you're a civilian, you're uniformed. I know that you're in a senior leadership position, and some of you are in mid-ranking or rank and file inside your organization. And I appreciate so much that you've raised your hand and say, I want to be a part of the solution. Rich, thank you so much for joining, for offering your perspective. This is the kind of stuff that has ripples beyond that you and I will never be aware of. So thank you everyone who joined, and we look forward to doing another one of these pretty soon. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Thank you, everyone.